Fantastic. So why the fuss about serverless? Does anybody know who I am at all? A few of you. Right, super. So I talk a lot about maps, the context in which things exist. So I'm going to talk about serverless, but we're going to start with the concept of strategy. And then we're going to go on to situational awareness. How do you understand a landscape? I'm going to introduce the concept of maps. We're then going to look at patterns. We're going to meet an elf along the way. And then we're going to use that to explain what is going on with serverless. So we start with strategy. I'm going to talk about my own personal experience with this field. So I'm going to take you all the way back to 2004. When I was the fat cat, I was the CEO of a small software company in Old Street. We were one of the first. And we used to run something called Fatango. It was one of about 16 different lines of business. It was an online photo service. Now, we had things like vision statements, things like this. Our strategy is customer-focused. We will lead an innovative effort of the market through our use of agile techniques and open source. It was all very exciting. We were very profitable. Revenue was growing. But we had a really big problem. And the big problem was me. You see, rather than being the chess-playing master of strategy that you'd hope most CEOs would be, I was a fake CEO. I didn't know what I was doing. I was making it up as I was going along. I was the alchemist, working on gut feel. So I started to get worried that people would rumble the fact that I was a fake CEO. And so I would go around listening to other CEOs talking about strategy, and I would record the words they were using. And I called them business-level abstractions of a healthy strategy, or the small words that people used, or BLAs for short. And I do this every couple of years. I did this in 2014. These are the common BLAs that everybody talks about. So digital business, big data, disruptive, innovative, collaborative, competitive advantage, ecosystem, etc. I mean, if I did it today, it would be all the same, plus AI, serverless, probably AR, VR, etc. And then what I did was I used to grab people's strategy documents, combine them together, and create a BLA template. So our strategy is BLA. We will lead a BLA effort of the market through our use of BLA and BLA to build a BLA. And then I would combine the BLAs and the BLA template and auto-generate 64 random gibberish strategies. Things like this. Our strategy is customer focus. We will lead a disruptive effort of the market through our use of innovative social media and big data to build a cloud-based revolution. Or things like this. Our strategy is innovative digital business. We will lead a growth effort of the market through our use of customer focus, competitive. I can barely say the words, they're that awful. But I would send them around and get responses. And last time I did this, I got about 400 responses of 3 basic types. Number 1, this is the exact wording from our business plan. Number 2, I've seen 2 of these used already. And my favorite was number 3, are you for hire? So a friend of mine actually has put this all online. This is strategy as a service. So if you ever need a strategy, just type in the URL and it will automatically generate you a pile of gibberish. And it saves a lot of money on consultants. If you don't like it, just press refresh. So I did this a couple of days ago. Our strategy is collaborating. Well, you know the nonsense. So I was sort of suspecting I wasn't the only one who was making it up. So I went back to first principles. I started off with Sun Tzu. Anybody heard of Sun Tzu? Do you know what he wrote? The Art of War. So Sun Tzu talked about 5 factors that mattered in competition. 1, understand your purpose, your moral imperative. 2, understand the landscape you're competing in. Then understand the climatic patterns. So in business, that's economic patterns that are impacting the landscape. then understand doctrine, universal principles of organization, and then it's all about leadership, as in context-specific play. Then I came across John Boyd. Anybody heard of John Boyd? What's he famous for? OODA loops. So US Air Force pilot. And so if you understand the game, your moral imperative, your focus, your scope, your mission, the next thing is to observe the environment. That's what landscape and climatic patterns are about. And then you orientate with doctrine, and then you decide where you're going to attack, and then you act. And I thought, wow, this is really exciting. So I shared it with others, and they went, well, it's not really that important because strategy is all about the importance of why. And for me, that's interesting because there's two whys. There's the why of purpose, as in I want to be the best tea shop in Ashford, which is near where I live. And there's the why of movement, as in why do I attack this space over that space? It's a bit like chess. There's the why of purpose, I want to win the game. And there's the why of movement, should I make that move or that move? And those are fundamentally different things. And it's through movement that we actually learn what works and what doesn't. So back at the tango, I thought, well, we sort of have a purpose. It's a bit of a mess because I wrote it. Well, basically, I copied it from other people because I didn't know what I was doing. How did we understand the landscape that we're competing in? And that got me into my second topic, which is situational awareness. How do we understand the environment? So I'm going to use 3 examples to explain this: Vikings, chess, and Themistocles. Vikings, very frightening people. This is how they used to navigate, with stories. From Herman, head due west towards Half, and you will have sailed north of Hatland, etc. What that story means is that. So, quick question. What would you use to navigate? A visual map or a verbal story? Excellent. What do you use in business? Verbal story. Super. So the next one is chess world. I want you to imagine you live in a world where everybody plays chess. How well you play chess determines your ranking in this world. But no one's ever seen a chessboard. All you've seen are these characters on a screen. You play the game very simply. You press a button, pawn. Your opponent sees what you press, they counter, pawn. You counter, pawn. They counter, queen. And the game goes on for ages and ages until it's a draw or somebody wins. Well, what will happen is we will take these sequences and stick them into our big data systems and come up with magic secrets of success. So if you press, I don't know, knight, I should respond with pawn, pawn, bishop. Now, if you don't think business is about magic secrets of success, you should read HBR, Harvard Business Review, how earlobes can signify leadership potential. It's November 2011. So what will happen one day is you will play a game of chess against someone who will see something truly magical, the board. And you will move and they will counter, and you will move and they will counter, and you will have lost. And you'll be sitting there going, what the fiddlesticks happened there? How did I lose? The first thing you're going to do is copy the sequence. You'll still lose. Then you'll go, maybe it's the speed at which they press the button. You'll still lose. Then you'll go, it's cultural. Maybe they're a happy sort of person. You'll still lose. You lose because you exist in a low-level situational awareness environment. So, what would you use to learn? Magic secrets of success or context-specific play? Right. What do we use in business? Excellent, super. Okay, next one. Themistocles, ancient politician, Greek general, had a problem. Persians were invading. What he decided to do was to block off the streets of Artemisium, force the Persians along the coastal road into Thermopylae. It's a narrow pass where a small number of troops could defend against a large force. There was about 4,000 Greeks against 170,000 Persians. In the 4,000 Greeks, there were 300 Spartans. Fantastic. Right. I want you to imagine you're part of the Athenian army. It's the eve of battle. You are standing there. Themistocles is giving you purpose, a moral imperative. You know, we've got to defend against the invading Persians. But then he says, I do not understand the landscape. I do not understand the environment. I have no map. But have no fear, for I have created a SWOT diagram. Strengths: a well-trained Spartan army, a high level of motivation not to become a Persian slave. Weaknesses: the E4s might stop the Spartans turning up. A truckload of Persians are turning up. Opportunities: get rid of the Persians, get rid of the Spartans. We're Athenian. We actually hate the Spartans. Threats: the Persians get rid of us. And the Oracle says a really dodgy film might be produced a few thousand years later. So what would you use to communicate and determine strategy in battle? Position and movement described by a map or some sort of 2x2 magic framework? Because you know what's coming next. What would you use? Great. What do you use in business? Yeah, we will grumble. Yeah, it's a magic framework. Okay, so if I go back to chess play versus alchemy, I look at navigation, learning, and strategy. Then chess is all visual, context-specific. It's all about position and movement. It's what we call a high-level situational awareness environment. It's a bit like the military. If you ask a general why did they bombard a hill, they won't say because 67% of other generals are bombing hills. They won't say because I read an article in General Weekly that bombing hills was the in thing, or that, you know, it would make a good story, or that's what Uber would do. It's all about position and movement. So alchemy is all about, you know, storytelling, magic framework, secrets of success, and me being a fake CEO, that's where I was. And I realized the problem was to do with maps. So the difference between these two environments is simply the existence of maps or not. Maps have certain characteristics which make them extremely useful. Those characteristics are navigational. So a map has to be visual, context-specific. It's a battle at hand, but you have position of pieces relative to some anchor, and you have the concept of movement. Same with a chessboard. It's actually a map. It has its visual, context-specific, position of pieces relative to an anchor, the board, and consistency of movement. Same with an underground map. The anchor being, in this case, the tube network. And I thought, wow, but we have maps. I have loads of maps. Actually, I had things like this, systems maps. Anybody ever seen one of those? Yes? Good, right. So you take a piece like CRM and you move it. What does that do to that map? Nothing whatsoever. It's still the same. That's because it's not a map. You know, if you take an atlas and you take France and you maybe shift France next to Australia, does that change the context of that map? Yes. So anyway, I had things like this, business process maps. Ever seen one of those? Yeah, they're not maps either. I also had, you know, well, more recently, we have digital roadmaps. Anyone seen one of these? They're not maps. We also had mind maps. Have a guess. Yes, they're not maps either. In fact, as inconceivable as it is, we keep on using that word, but I do not think it means what we think it means. So how do you map? This is the problem I faced in 2005. So I had a cup of tea. And while having a cup of tea, I realized, as a user, I had a need for a cup of tea, and a cup of tea has needs. It needs tea, it needs hot water, and hot water has needs. It needs a kettle, it needs cold water, and kettle has needs, it needs power. So I've got an anchor, the user, and I've got position relative to the anchor. So I could take one of my network topologies, focus on the customer at the top, the anchor, describe the components underneath in a value chain, and I'm part of the way there. Unfortunately, that is still useless. It's useless because I have no movement. So like Nokia was a paper mill, became a plastics manufacturer. You somehow have to describe change. So I took one thing, power, looked into the history of power. You start off with a Parthian battery. about 400 AD or whatever, and then eventually you end up with Tesla and Westinghouse, utility provision of electricity, and that marketing chap, Edison. Anyway, so this process of evolution is change and change and movement. And it turned out there was a pattern for how things evolved. If you look at the ubiquity versus the certainty of something, you start off with a genesis of novel and new ideas, custom-built examples, products, rental services, commodity, and utility services. So what I could do is I could take my value chain, flatten the evolution curve, put things where they should be, and in 2005, I had a map. Power, very much commodity. Compute, very much late product. And what we were building, somewhat more novel and new. So what? Why does any of that matter? Well, this is where we get into patterns. You see, if I can understand the landscape, I can start to observe climatic patterns. So these are the rules that influence the game. So it turns out that everything in your map is evolving due to supply and demand competition. Starts on the left, ends up on the right. As it evolves, its characteristics change. It starts in this uncharted space of being uncertain, unknown, unpredictable, and then it becomes industrialized, ordered, standard, stable, dull, boring. Doesn't matter whether it's money, whether it's penicillin, or computing. Turned out there's no such thing as one-size-fits-all methods. Agile was very good, as in extreme programming, extremely good on the left-hand side, because it reduced the cost of change. But it sucked on the right-hand side compared to Six Sigma, which was very good at reducing deviation. And in the middle, well, these days you'd probably use Lean Startup. So it's all about reducing waste and learning. So no one-size-fits-all. We then learnt, as things evolve, we have inertia to that. Blockbuster, Netflix. Who was first with a website? Good. Who was first with video ordering online? Blockbuster, well done. Who was first with video streaming? Blockbuster, fantastic. Right, who went bankrupt first? Right, it wasn't through lack of innovation. Do you know what took out Blockbuster? Yeah, other than Netflix. That's good. That's worth a round of applause. Who took out, other than Netflix, what do you think hammered? Stores. And do you know what it was special about stores? Late fees. That's how they made their business. Well, that's most of their business model. Is late fees. You know, you'd buy. Okay, we used to get these things called video cassettes. I tell my son about this, and he goes, "What's a video cassette? What's a video?" But anyway, so they used to make money from late fees. That's what caused the problem. Okay, so if you start to learn these common economic patterns, and there's 27 of them, you can start to anticipate. So there we were in 2005. We knew that compute and platform would go to a utility. We knew we'd have inertia. We knew it would enable higher order systems to appear. That's another pattern. So this gives us an idea of where should we invest. Should we build the first ever utility compute environment, the first ever utility code execution platform? Should we wait until somebody else does and build on top? Should we differentiate in terms of the online photo service? Of course, when I used to say to people that this whole change is going to happen, they would go, oh, you know, particularly when it appeared cloud is for startups. You'd argue it'll dominate the market in 10 to 15 years because that's the same pattern that's occurred beforehand, and they would all go, you know, burn him heretic, that sort of thing. So once you get beyond understanding the landscape and climatic patterns and you get into anticipation, you get into doctrine. So these are the universally applicable principles. So if you think about military, flanking versus firing, flanking an opponent is context specific, whereas firing is universally useful to practice that beforehand. So things like focus on user needs. Surprise, that turns out to be a universally useful thing to do. I mean, in 2005, it was a massive shock for most companies. Removing bias and duplication turns out to be a really useful thing to do. So in government, you have maps like borders, immigration, police. You share the maps. You start discovering the same thing appears in different places. Now, anybody thinking government is inefficient, the worst example of duplication I found in government is 118 workflow systems doing the same thing. The worst example I've got in the private sector is a bank which keeps on complaining it can't innovate, but it's built risk management 1,000 times. They are brilliant at innovation. It's just they keep on rebuilding the wheel in a slightly different shade of blue. So you have a map, and then you start going, well, we've removed bias and duplication. Let's make sure we use the right methods. We'll outsource the stuff on the right, maybe use cloud providers, off-the-shelf products in the middle. On the left, we'll use agile techniques. And of course, all of this stuff will evolve and eventually end up in the cloud. So you take somebody like HS2, high-speed rail, start off with a box and wire, turn it into a map. Suddenly we know what methods we need to use, and that's 2011. Anybody do anything with self-driving cars? Anybody know what a world perception server is? Anybody from finance? Okay. I'm going to pretend you're all from finance, which means everything in IT looks elvish to you. So here's a systems diagram for a self-driving car, which I've converted to elvish. I'm going to ask you a question. Should we outsource or build our own, that bit over there? Should we outsource or build our own B? What do you think? You haven't got a clue, have you? No one does. Right, exactly the same diagram in elvish turned into a map. Should I outsource or build our own? A. Outsource. Build our own or outsource? B. And you turn it back into English, you see GPS, world perception server. So back to Fatango, there we are, removing bias and duplication, starting to use multiple methods, starting to break down in using constraints, small services, starting to build with small teams, cell-based structures, starting to discover you've got different aptitude and attitudes. This is a structure known as pioneers, settlers, and town planners. It turns out you need wonderful people in each of those attitudes. And this is all about doctrine. Now, if you want to read more about that, GCHQ has very kindly open sourced something called Boiling Frogs, which tells you how to organize and cope with constant disruption. So now we go back to our little wheel. We've sort of got to understand our purpose. We're understanding the landscape. We're understanding climatic patterns. We're starting to anticipate. We're getting into doctrine. We're now into the gameplay and strategy, context-specific gameplay. So this is the flanking versus firing bit. So you've got a map. You know it's evolving. You know where to invest. It's now a question of can you manipulate the market to your favor using, say, an open source play to drive something to more industrialized form, using fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Oh, you don't want to use that cloud stuff to slow the process, using constraints. There's 27 common economic patterns, 40 different forms of doctrine, 70 different ways of gameplay. And so you use that to come up with what we call context-specific play, which is what we did at Fatango. We realized that platform would go to a utility, so we built the first ever serverless code execution environment where you built entire applications in one language, JavaScript front and back end, built on a functional billing with no concept of servers underneath it. We knew somebody else would likely do a utility compute play. Remember, this is 2005. I thought it was going to be Google. It turned out it was Amazon the next year. And we knew other people could build on top, so there was a whole ecosystem model, a very specific one called ILC that we could exploit. So we acted. We launched the world's first serverless environment. Anybody remember Zimke? A couple. Cool. And it started growing like hotcakes. It was fabulous. And then, of course, Amazon launched, and it was like, yes, brilliant. And then, of course, the parent company had some very expensive consultants in who said the three things that we were doing, this cloud stuff, 3D printing, and mobile phones as cameras, were not the future. It was not core. The core was 3D television. So they shut it all down, spent $1 billion on 3D TV. Anybody own a 3D TV? No. So I went to Ubuntu, where we mapped it all out, used the same method in 2008. We were about 2% of the operating system market. It took us 18 months, about half a million. We took 70% of all cloud computing. Then I started working in government, and these days, most of the stuff I do is nation-state competition. So, we talked about strategy. We've gone through situational awareness and onto maps and now patterns. So let's get to serverless. And let's start in the beginning. In the beginning, there was Colossus. So we built applications, very novel and new idea, on compute. And we used to patch those applications, which means we used to shift physical wires. And then what happened is the idea of compute started to evolve and applications evolved, and we came out with custom-built systems like Leo, Lions Electronic Office. And we created new things called operating systems, which sat in between our application and our hardware. And all of that started to evolve until we got to the point of producing products. IBM 650. And of course, now we had products, we had to develop architectural practices for how to manage them. And those architectural practices were based upon the characteristics of products, so high MTTR, or mean time to recovery, which means when your server went bang, it took weeks to get a new one. So you did things like disaster recovery tests, M+1. Anybody remember M+1? Yes. Scale up, capacity planning. Anybody remember capacity planning? It's the old world. Anyway, those spread. Products got more and more evolved. Those novel architectural practices spread and became good practice. And then we started coming up with frameworks, which unfortunately we call platforms now. So we end up with applications built with emerging coding practice, built upon some sort of framework, often custom-built, heading towards product, built on an operating system, built on good architectural practices, built on compute as a product, so server. And all of that stuff evolved until we ended up with best coding practice, built upon product frameworks, operating systems, built upon best architectural practice, built upon products, which were servers. And everybody was happy. And then something dreadful happened. Cloud. Compute went from a product to a utility. And so every business went, well, I want to make my stuff cloudy. So they put their stuff on Amazon. Amazon has an outage. And then they run around saying the end of cloud is nigh. To which you go, shouldn't our architecture evolve as well? To which they respond, burn him, heretic. But yes, that's a common economic pattern. You get a co-evolution of practice with the underlying activity. So this co-evolution of practice is because we're no longer about high MTTR, we're about low MTTR. So when your server goes bang, it takes seconds to create a new one. So rather than M+1, disaster recovery, capacity planning, we're all distributed systems designed for failure, chaos engines. That's the norm. Chaos monkey. And that evolved. And it took about 4 or 5 years until about 2009, when eventually it was sort of starting to form. We created a meme for it. We called it Devops. So all the stuff that we were doing 2004, 2005, 2006 now was under this umbrella which we call DevOps. That was great, and it continued. And the old world, the best architectural practices built upon product, we gave that a new name. We called it legacy. And of course, they didn't like that, and so they had inertia to this change. But we had this new tribe around DevOps form. And we would tell everybody about the wonders of it's all about user needs, it's all about measurement, iterative cycles, automation. It's all about collaboration, speed, feedback loops. Isn't it brilliant? And someone would respond, so was ITIL. And we'd go, burn him, heretic. But it was all good. Operating systems becoming more of a commodity. And then something dreadful happened. Lambda. So all of a sudden, frameworks, platforms, suddenly become a utility, code execution environments. And we get the same sort of thing, explosion of novel emerging architectural practices, new ways of working on top of it. We haven't quite got to the point of giving it a sensible name at the moment, which is why Jeff is as good as we're going to get until somebody comes up with that sort of term. But of course, it will evolve. And that is the future. Code execution environments, a new set of practices combining probably finance and development built on top. Yay. And a new tribal form. And all the rest of the stuff is legacy. Of course, if you turn up and say DevOps is the new legacy, they all go, burn him, heretic. But this is all normal. Tribe's got a tribe. The future of DevOps, next 5 to 10 years, well, it's like this. Young serverless, I will teach you so much. Sod off, Daddy DevOps, I'm learning from Grandma ITIL. All new tribes reject the parent. So let's connect all the way back from serverless to strategy. That's where you should be investing. Serverless in terms of building on top of it, and the new emerging practices which we don't even have a good name or meme for. That is the past, the legacy stuff. If you're sitting there going, I'm going to build a DevOps team and everything else in the next 7 years, by the time you're up and running, you will find everybody will have moved. Of course, you're going to say, well, DevOps is that new world, but the new world is going to reject it despite the fact it will inherit from it. Now, if I look down that value chain and I go all the way back down to compute, the big significant change was a shift from high to low MTTR. So what's the equivalent in the coding environment? Well, remember I said I built this first serverless environment in 2005, and we ran it for about a year. We noticed some massive changes, and a lot of that was to do with the obscurity of cost. To give you an example, large format printing. I built a system for a client which was called large format printing. Now, normally we do this by having some sort of contract, which invariably ends up with us having an argument over what's in or what's not in the contract. We introduced a system called worth-based development. We built it for free, but we would take a metric of the value that it generated, or a percentage of the value it generated. It's very simple. The client wanted more consumers. Consumers wanted to test out printers. We needed some sort of microsite, some sort of, that had to be built on some sort of platform along with a testing application, a mechanism for printing out prints, and a distribution channel. And there's various flows in this value chain which we could add metrics to, number of customers, cost per print, and build business cases from. But we had a problem to begin with, and the problem was platform, because it wasn't an operational cost. So we had to guess how much capacity we would need, and we'd have to invest and plan for this, and we could be completely wrong. Fortunately, for us, platform was now more of a utility, which means the entire business model could be variable. And so that's what we built. It was fabulous, except for the fact that in the first 3 months it sold something like 20,000 large format printers, which is about 40 million euros, and now my take was about 500,000 euros. And I get phoned up by the client, and they ask me to switch it off. And I go, well, it's a revenue-generating profit-generating system. Why switch it off? I know what your margins are. You're doing really well. And it's only cost you 500,000 euros. And they said, that's the problem. I only budgeted 500,000 euros for the first year. And I have to go through a budget cycle. It would take me 6 months to get more money in order to keep the system running. So can you please switch off profit and revenue generating system in order for me to go through an arbitrary budget cycle? This sort of thing will become more common. So one of the things about serverless and the shift to operational billing of functions, it enables things like worth-based development. It enables you to create entire business models which are operational. Second thing, suddenly refactoring has financial value. And that's huge, because your application is a function, and within your function, your application, there are many other sub-functions. The billing by function alone enables you to spot which bit of your code is actually incurring most of the cost. It changes the way you develop things. Thirdly, code efficiency. I talk about a bank having 1,000 risk management systems. Who here has ever written a user function which adds users? Hands up. All right, keep your hands up if you've written it more than once. More than 10 times. All right, the level of duplication within systems is astronomical compared to the duplication between. So it also leads to rapid acceleration, particularly when you get a marketplace of functions and services available, and we're heading in that direction, and you start getting effective code reuse, which was the lie of object-oriented design, because we didn't get any communication mechanism. And finally, it changes monitoring. So all of this stuff is going to change because of serverless, and that's why the fuss about serverless. So when will this happen? That's a typical adoption cycle, diffusion curve, 10 to 15 years, unless you're an enterprise, in which case you run a slightly slower path, going through phases of ignore the change. No, we're not going to do it. No, I said no, damn it. Oh no, and oh fiddlesticks, until you have no choice. So in summary, we've gone from strategy to situational awareness to map to patterns to serverless. This is all explained in a simple line from Deng Xiaoping called Crossing the River by Feeling the Stones. Have a purpose and have a direction, adapt along the path. So understand that strategy is a cycle, you need to act, and as you go along, make sure you observe the environment, and today where you should be investing is both in the serverless side and the novel functions that are building, or novel practices that are building on top. And that's me. Thank you.